There's a church deep in the heart of Sicily, in the city of Palermo, that presents us with a mystery. The church itself was finally consecrated in 1140, but what it contains is something that causes far more questions than answers for the modern viewer. For example, as you walk in, expecting to see the interior of a Latin Christian church, a Roman Catholic church, you will find elements of that. But what immediately seizes your attention is the astonishing, shining blue and gold of a mosaic that meets your eye on the far wall. And what it depicts is Jesus Christ Pantocrator. And Pantocrator is a term and an image which comes directly from Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition. So the depiction of Jesus Christ in this art is distinctively Byzantine. By that I mean its gold mosaic pattern. It's composed of tiny little tiles, which together form this astonishing portrait. And it's recognizably Jesus Christ, but not in the style of depiction that Roman Catholic or Latin churches typically have. It's the sort of depiction that you would find on the church walls of the Hagia Sophia in what is now Istanbul, but what used to be Constantinople, or the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire. And so it's amazing to find in Sicily what seems to be a page directly out of a Greek Orthodox church. But it doesn't end there. Inside this astonishing church, you will also find distinctively Muslim elements. These include the muqarnas ceiling, which, if you've ever looked at any sort of Islamic architecture, such as in Andalusia or in parts of Egypt, in Cairo, the muqarnas is a very distinctive feature. It's very hard to execute, requires an advanced grasp of math and geometry, because what you will see in a muqarnas ceiling is distinctively interlocking geometric patterns, so many of them and so intricately combined that they dazzle the eye. And together they form patterns within patterns of triangles and stars and octagons. And this is the sort of detail that we see on the ceiling. So in one church, you will find Latin Christian elements, Eastern Byzantine or Orthodox Christian elements, and then architecture that comes straight out of the Muslim world. Now, you might be tempted to assume that this is just a church where different communities inhabited the space one at a time. Perhaps there were Greeks, and then there were Arabs, and then there were Roman Catholics, and each of them reused the space, but inhabited it separately. But that is not the story. The story we're going to talk about today is the story of Norman Sicily. And this church, the Cappella Palatina, or Royal Chapel, was built for the use of a Norman king and his family inside the palace complex from which they ruled all of Sicily. The Palazzo dei Normani, or the Norman Palace, in which this chapel appears, is located in the city of Palermo, the capital of Sicily, and has been the seat of government there for centuries. The royal chapel that we've been speaking of was built by the Norman kings, and these Normans were the descendants of Vikings several generations later who relocated to France and then arrived in Italy. And for the story of how that happened, go ahead and listen to the previous episode on when the Vikings invaded Italy. But here in this palace, what we see is a very different chapter in the history of Normans in Sicily. It's a chapter of stability. It's a chapter where they've established rule and they're defining what that is going to look like in a way that makes them remarkably different from any other European monarchy at the time. This royal chapel was commissioned by King Roger II and involved hiring artists from around the world At the same time, there were Muslims, there were Greek Orthodox Christians, and there were Latin Christians working simultaneously on the construction and decoration of this chapel. So, who were the Normans, and how did all this happen? You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is the second episode in a series on the Normans in Sicily. Before we get into today's story, I would like to pause and thank the wonderful people who are supporting this podcast on Patreon, and in particular, my newest top-tier supporters, Anthony Farnbach and Tim Williams. Thank you so much. You make it possible to do more episodes just like this. Patreon supporters get access to exclusive additional content, including live Q&A sessions after each new episode, as well as bonus mini tidbits and posts that are available on Patreon as well. So if you're interested in getting a little behind-the-scenes content on this podcast and supporting its production, head on over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert. In our previous episode on the Normans in Sicily, we focused a lot of attention on Robert Guiscard, and he was perhaps the most successful of the many Norman adventurers that came into southern Italy and eventually into Sicily itself. Now, Robert Guiscard was not only a Norman, but he was a Norman from a particularly successful Norman family. They lived in Normandy, the part of France that had been settled by these Normans or Northmen. And because Robert Guiscard and many of his brothers weren't the firstborn son, they found it necessary to seek their fortunes elsewhere. And so they end up in southern Italy, where there are opportunities to be hired as mercenary soldiers. So Robert Guiscard and Normans like him quickly acquire a reputation for being incredibly effective soldiers. They're perhaps the most popular mercenaries for hire in southern Italy and Sicily as well. And pretty much everybody hires these guys. So very soon, we'd see Normans not just coming down to Italy to fight during fighting season and then returning home, but actually establishing their own bases and their own territories. And this, of course, gets them into some trouble. People are happy to hire mercenaries, but they're not so happy when these guys decide to put down stakes and take land, which is going to become their property. So our last episode is very much the story of how Robert Guiscard successfully carves out territory for himself in southern Italy, and how, with the help of his younger brother Roger, they successfully begin the conquest of Sicily. But that latter task was not an easy one. It would take nearly 30 years. So we saw some scenes of that struggle in our previous story, culminating with the taking of Palermo, and we're going to pick up from there today. But before we do that, a quick note. The Normans are exasperating to those of us who read history because they all seem to want to be called Robert or Roger. And so it's very difficult sometimes to follow a story when on the same page there are two different Rogers and two different Roberts, and all of these may or may not have direct familial connections as well as rivalries. It can be very confusing. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to refer to three of them, and they are as follows. Robert Guiscard, who's the older brother of the family, and who establishes his territory in southern Italy. His brother Roger, who will also be called here Roger the First, who takes over Sicily with his older brother's help, but the two of them decide to split the territory so that Robert Guiscard is stationed in mainland southern Italy, and Roger the First will make his base in Sicily. So today's episode will be focusing a lot on Roger the First in Sicily, who was then succeeded by his son, Roger the Second. Now, when Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger first arrive in mainland southern Italy, it's a very chaotic place. It's a place where there is no stable centralized government. It's a bunch of territories that are constantly being competed for by a number of power players in the region. And so to understand how our story is going to unfold, we need to remind ourselves who these are. First of all, there's the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, which is based out of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire historically had territories in southern Italy and Sicily, so they have an ongoing interest in trying to control or regain some of that land. And we see them at times making alliances with various other players in the region for this purpose. So we have the Byzantines. Then we have the Lombards, who are basically Germanic tribes that had some time ago migrated into Italy, and they've carved out their own little kingdoms and duchies and principalities, and they're forever fighting each other to try and increase their own individual holdings. And it's some Lombards who are some of the first people to hire mercenary Normans to help them come and fight their battles. Then we have the Pope, and you think of the Pope as the leader of the Western Christian Church, which is true, but the Pope was also the Prince of Rome, a political title which came with territory, also known as the Papal States, which are south of Rome. And so, as a landowner and someone who collected taxes from the Papal States, he also has a very non religious set of interests in terms of control of territory and concern about who might be on the borders of the lands that he owns. So that's three: the Byzantines, the Lombards, the Pope. Now we've also got the Holy Roman Emperor, who's of course headquartered farther north, much closer to the area we now call Germany. But he is very important to this story because the popes, historically, over centuries, have had a habit of calling in military support from the Holy Roman Emperor and his Frankish armies. So from time to time, he makes journeys down into Italy and influences the balance of power there. So we've got four major players so far: the Byzantine Empire, the Lombards, the Pope, and the Holy Roman Emperor. Add to that mix the Muslim presence, because when the Normans first arrive, Sicily is a Muslim emirate. It is ruled by Muslims and largely populated by Muslims. So you can see how all of this becomes very, very complicated politically. And to follow the history of this area is to watch a constantly shifting set of alliances and aggressions as these players sometimes ally with each other or against each other to pursue their own interests. Now, Norman involvement in Italy changed the balance of power permanently. We've now added another major element to the game board, if you will. While the Normans were officially Latin Christians, they never allowed their religious identity to get in the way of political or territorial interests. You may recall from the last episode that a Norman army not only defeated the Pope's army at the Battle of Civitate in 1053, but they also take that Pope, Leo IX, hostage, and they hold him for 9 months until he agrees to recognize or give legitimacy to the Normans holding the territories in Italy that they had already seized. A later pope went a step further and promised the Normans that he would legitimize their rule of Sicily if only they could take it from the Arabs first. And so this was the event that led to the 30 years of effort, where we see Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger I allying to gradually take over Sicily itself. Now, 30 years is a long time, and I definitely don't have the space here to detail for you all the major highlights of that period, but there are a couple of astonishing stories from that 30-year conquest period, and I want to share two of them briefly. For example, there was the hair-raising story of how Roger I nearly lost his bride. So Roger had been a young man of no particular significance back home in Normandy. Before he and his older brother Robert left, they were just two boys from many in this large clan called the Hauteville clan, and they weren't going to inherit a lot of land. They weren't particularly wealthy, so a man of no consequence back home. And it was when he lived back at home with the rest of his family in Normandy that Roger laid eyes on a very beautiful young woman named Judith. Apparently, she also laid eyes on Roger and liked what she saw, but she was from a far more important Norman family, and they weren't particularly impressed by Roger and his father. Judith was the daughter of the first cousin of a very famous Norman, who you know as William the Conqueror, the same guy who would later take over England in the Battle of Hastings, 1066. So this is a couple of decades before that interesting event when Roger is making eyes at Judith, but she still comes from a very important family, and it's highly unlikely that they would have permitted her to marry Roger. So she must have been devastated when this young Norman knight rode off to seek his fortune in southern Italy, and she probably thought she would never see him again. But in this prediction, she proved to be happily incorrect, because some years later, after Roger and his older brother Robert had established themselves very successfully in southern Italy and were currently working on conquering Sicily, Judith shows up. And she shows up with some male family members. There's been a family quarrel. She and her guardian were on the wrong side of it, so they were on the run, and they end up in southern Italy. Word of this reaches Roger, and he runs over to the town where she's rumored to be staying. The two are reunited, and they get married basically on the spot. So this is kind of an astonishing story for the Middle Ages, where so many marriages from aristocratic families were for political or strategic reasons. And this one seems to have been a love match that these two got away with because Roger just happened to do well on his gamble for making a name for himself in Italy. And Judith happened to find herself there after some unfortunate family events. So somehow they got past the interests of their families and they marry. So this happens in 1061. The two are still newlyweds when they head over to Sicily together. And you can imagine, therefore, how Roger felt when he discovered shortly after that his beautiful young wife was being held hostage. They had scarcely been married a year, and Roger returned to Sicily with Judith in the summer of 1062 to continue the campaigning season. He brought his wife to the town of Troina, which was then occupied by a largely Greek community because of the island's Greek past before the Muslim arrival. There were many Greek communities in Sicily, as there are to this day. After a couple of weeks, he leaves Judith in this town, which is occupied by a Norman garrison, and he goes off with the main body of Norman troops to pursue the Arabs. What Roger failed to realize was that the Normans were resented by the community of Troina. The Greeks there had found that their new Norman overlords weren't behaving much better than their previous Arab overlords, particularly when it came to the treatment of local women. They had a number of grievances with these large, sometimes thuggish Normans who now occupied the town and basically did exactly as they pleased. So the community must have begun plotting almost as soon as Roger arrived, because he'd only stayed for a couple of weeks, and no sooner had he departed the town, the community there attacked the Norman garrison with the objective of capturing Judith. The Norman garrison were taken by surprise, and they fought off the attackers bravely, trying to defend Judith and their citadel where they were holed up. But they knew they couldn't hold out for long. So they send a messenger to slip through the lines and chase after Roger to let him know that they're in trouble and they need his help. When Roger gets this message, he turns around with the forces that he has and makes back for Troina as fast as his horse can gallop. When Roger and his troops arrive, they find that the situation is going from bad to worse. So they're able to rejoin their comrades who are stuck in their garrison quarters, but there are now Saracen or Muslim troops that are descending on the city. So the number of attackers they're going to have is about to increase. So Roger and his men take up a defensive position around the citadel. They're with Judith, but they're soon going to be surrounded and outnumbered. And what happens here is a siege of the Normans inside the town that lasts for 4 months. This is something that none of them were prepared for. So they hadn't laid up supplies. They didn't have any equipment to deal with the end of summer and into the cool autumn and early winter months, which is what they were going to be stuck with. And so you have this image of Roger and his young wife Judith and these Normans stuck inside these stone walls. They're surrounded by enemies. The Muslim army has taken up positions around them, along with the hostile inhabitants of the town. So there's no escaping. They're outnumbered. They've managed to maintain their perimeter and their walls so that they're not being overrun, but they can't hold out indefinitely. And their opponents know this. So the Muslim soldiers and their Greek Christian collaborators are content to watch the Normans shiver and starve, knowing that eventually they're going to have to give in. Now, there are reports that Roger's men kept up morale as best they could. There was a lot of gallows humor and attempts to keep attitudes positive, but there was no way out that anybody could see. But Roger watched, and he waited, and they shivered with the few blankets that they could scrape together. Everyone was underdressed, and weeks turned into months. We can only imagine what Judith was thinking about where she'd got herself to and what fate might await her at the end of this siege. But Roger noticed something. He noticed that the Muslim soldiers around the town were drinking wine at night. And being observant Muslims, they weren't in the habit of drinking a lot of wine, but they decided to do this as a way of keeping off the cold. So he noticed that the night watch would be drinking wine to try and warm up in the chilly evening. And as the weeks went on, the quantities of alcohol they consumed increased. And so very soon, they were beginning to have inebriated naps while on watch. And this was where Roger saw an opportunity. So Roger observed this, he gathered his men, and he made a daring plan. One bitterly cold winter night, when all of the sound from the soldiers around Roger and his besieged Normans had faded into silence, Roger and his men silently emerged from their citadel and overran the positions of the sleeping Arab soldiers around them. They quickly overpowered and killed these men, and before morning, they had taken all the strategic positions in the town. The rebellion was over. The Normans had regained the city, and while they executed the ringleaders of the rebellion in Troina, it was an excellent illustration of how precarious the situation was in Sicily and how quickly loyalties could shift. Roger had perhaps assumed that the Greek Christians of Troina would prefer Latin Norman Christians to anybody else, but in this he found himself completely mistaken. His hold over the existing population would have to be based on something other than religious affiliation, and it was a lesson that he was unlikely to forget. It may even have been an episode like Troina that caused him to make very deliberate decisions decades later about how he would rule this very complex and culturally mixed society. Then there was the Battle of Missilmeri in 1068, yet another engagement in the Norman attempt to conquer Sicily. So in this battle, we see the Normans and their forces facing off against a numerically superior Arab force. But as frequently happened, the Normans won this battle because they were far more adept at moving as units. And so their lines were less easily broken, but they were much better able to inflict these kinds of scattering moments on the enemy army, which could turn the tide of a battle. So the Normans are victorious, and they're then able to seize the baggage trains of the Arab army. Now, baggage trains aren't really what is shown in Hollywood depictions of medieval warfare, but no army could travel without them. The baggage train was where you kept things like your tent equipment, your cooking equipment, your food supplies that were supposed to last for weeks or even months. So, very important material. The Normans find, among the Arab baggage carts, 3 baskets of messenger pigeons. So messenger pigeons actually hadn't been used since ancient times. The Normans themselves weren't in the habit of using these, but the Arabs, who were busy reading Greek and Roman texts at the time, had revived the practice. When Robert Guiscard, the Norman commander, finds these pigeons, he understands what they're for, and he decides to put them to good use. So he instructs his men to take bits of cloth, blood-stained cloth, off the bodies of dead Arab soldiers and to tie them to the feet of each messenger pigeon. He then sets them free, and the messenger pigeons do exactly what they're trained to do. They fly home, bearing with them the bloody news of the defeat of the Arab army. And this was so demoralizing for the Arab ruler in Palermo at the time that he fled back to North Africa, never to return. And when he did this, he left his troops and his administrators and the seat of Arab government in Palermo, in Sicily, extremely demoralized. So we see here Robert Guiscard waging psychological warfare on his enemy in Palermo before actually arriving with his army around that city and eventually taking it. Try to imagine for a moment what it must have felt like for the inhabitants of Palermo, government administrators, the emir of Palermo himself, and the many women whose husbands were enlisted in that war, anxiously waiting for news of their return. But instead of news, just the whisper of pigeon wings descending across the city with these bloody bits of fabric which, upon inspection, would have been recognized as the cloth and the uniforms worn by their sons, their brothers, and their husbands. It must have been an absolutely horrifying experience. Now, when the Normans took Palermo, and eventually the entire island of Sicily, they employed a pragmatism which allowed them to hold the territory that they had taken. For example, they offered very generous terms to the inhabitants of Palermo. They said, in exchange for surrender, your lives and your property will be respected. In other words, we're not going to allow our army to run in and sack your city and pillage and rape and enslave. That's not going to happen. So if you surrender, you keep your property, you keep your lives. Instead, you'll simply just have to accept a Norman governor who's now going to take the place of your emir, and you're going to have to pay annual tribute. But apart from that, everything can continue pretty much as it has been. In fact, many Muslims who were working in administration in various parts of the city were allowed to keep their jobs. The Normans basically left most of the infrastructure intact. They just put a different figurehead at the peak of that power structure, and that was one of their guys. And this pragmatism, this allowing people to get on with their lives and not enforcing radical change, was perhaps informed by the near disaster at Troina. It was a different way of trying to rule a population which they hoped would be more successful this time. So instead of remodeling Sicily by importing an entirely foreign ruling class of administrators and landholders, the Normans chose to adapt to the structures that they found. They even issued all of their official proclamations in the three languages that were spoken by the inhabitants of Sicily. And these were Arabic, Greek, and Latin. So while the Normans themselves spoke Old French, and they did that amongst themselves and at court, they were acutely aware that they had very different people as their subjects, and they communicated with those people in their own languages. The period from the Norman conquest of Sicily in 1091 to 1194 is a century of stability and prosperity that was ushered in by Norman rule. Sicily had been a much less stable place before the Normans arrived. Very much like the rest of southern Italy, it was constantly competed over by various smaller rulers. So the Muslims who had been in Sicily fought amongst themselves, including within their families for control of various pieces. And so there was a lot of fighting, there was a lot of instability, and this damaged trade, it damaged security for local people. So when the Normans came in and they said, look, you guys can keep your religion, you can keep your language, most of you can keep your jobs, you can keep your property, just pay taxes to us and follow the rules. This ended up being actually a remarkably good deal for many of the people there, and as a result, business boomed. We see that under the Norman period, for this century, Palermo becomes a trading hub for the entire Mediterranean. Merchants come in from North Africa, they come in from Greece, they come down from the rest of Italy. The ports are hubs of activity. There are things being traded from around the world because it's safe. And so the wealth increases and prosperity of Sicily itself vastly improves. Now, as I've said previously, the Normans themselves are Latin Christians, and they've been legitimized by the Pope. He's the one who's sort of given the blessing for them to take over Sicily and parts of southern Italy. But they are also patrons of Greek Orthodox monasteries in Sicily because they know that the ancient Greek Christian communities there will be very resentful if they see that their monasteries and their churches are falling into disrepair and Latin Christian ones are taking their place. So the Normans are sensitive to this. So Roger I, the younger brother of Robert Guiscard, who ends up ruling over Italy, is very sensitive to these concerns. And so he goes out of his way to put money into repairing Greek Orthodox monasteries so that these communities are assured that they have a place in Sicily. They're not just waiting to be moved aside by a Latin Christian community that's going to be newly infused by royal patronage and royal favor. In addition to keeping the Greek communities happy, Roger makes a deliberate attempt to encourage the Muslims that he now rules over and to employ them, not just at court, but very famously as soldiers. And so there are many reports of Roger's crack Saracen units, divisions of the army that are populated exclusively by Arabs, who become loyal soldiers under their new Norman ruler. This is kind of astonishing when you think about it, because the medieval world is often portrayed to us as the world of the Crusades, the world where religious identity is everything and Christian states are fighting against Muslim states and what your religion is determines your political loyalties. But not in this case. In this case, we see a Latin Christian king with an army full of loyal Muslim Arab soldiers. Figure that one out. Norman kings began signing their names in Arabic as well as Latin on official documents. And this was a way of positioning themselves as the legitimate rulers of all of their communities, no matter what their cultural or linguistic backgrounds might be. And bilingualism was extremely common amongst administrators in Norman Sicily. Many people could speak both Greek and Arabic because those had been the long-standing languages of the region. There was even an Arabic-speaking Christian community that was quite old in Sicily, which was a very important link between the Arab Muslim communities and the Greek Christian communities. So there's all kinds of interchange going on amongst the population. Perhaps it's less astonishing, then, to imagine how a society like this produced the royal chapel that we began describing at the beginning of this episode. But we're just getting started. So Roger I, the younger of the two Norman brothers, is successfully established as the ruler of Sicily. He's taken the island after 30 years of campaigning with consistent help from his older brother, Robert Guiscard. But these two Norman brothers have made a division of labor and revenue and territory between themselves. So for the campaign in Sicily, Robert Guiscard would come over from the mainland with funding and with troops, and he would help his younger brother Roger to conquer the island. It took many years, as I've said. But the deal was this. Roger would administer all of the land, but half of Sicily would have its revenues payable to Robert Guiscard. So he was going to collect the tax revenue from half of this newly conquered territory. But Robert Guiscard, the older brother, kept his political base in southern Italy, specifically Apulia and Calabria. Roger, the younger brother, often had to go and return the favor in southern Italy on the mainland when his older brother Robert needed help quelling uprisings of rebellious barons under his rule. And there were lots and lots of those. The tale of southern Italy is one of continuous rebellion, and we're going to see some of that unfolding even in the decades to come. So these two brothers have an arrangement, and the older brother, Robert Guiscard, remains very ambitious even to the end of his life. We saw at the end of the last episode, he was embarked on a campaign that was heading to Constantinople, and had he been successful, he might even have crowned himself the Emperor of Byzantium. Fortunately for the Greeks, he died of a fever in a military camp en route, so he never did make it. But he leaves behind him a well-established Norman-ruled chunk of southern Italy. And when he dies, the question is, what's going to become of this southern Italian territory that he's taken? The younger Norman brother, Roger, though, lived for another decade after his older brother, Robert, had passed away. And during this time, he consolidated his rule in Sicily and slowly began to chip away at taking some of the territory in Sicily that had originally been paying taxes to his older brother back for himself. So he's working on expanding his hold so that he collects all the revenues from the island for himself. Roger's first wife, Judith, who so narrowly escaped becoming a hostage in the town of Troina, dies young. And as a result, Roger marries several more times. However, in his late 50s, he had only one legitimate son, and that boy was a leper. So Roger I was having a crisis. After spending his entire life campaigning to build an empire in Sicily, he was at risk of losing it all if he didn't have a legitimate male heir. So in his 50s, he marries again, a much younger woman by the name of Adelaide de Vasto. She gives him two sons. The older one is called Simon, and the younger one is, yes, another Roger, okay? Roger II has entered the story. So Roger I is the father, and his young wife Adelaide produces Simon and Roger II. These are his two legitimate sons. Now, Roger I dies in 1101, leaving behind him his young wife and these two boys. The older one, Simon, is 8 at the time, and the young Roger II is only 5. This means that Adelaide, their mother, is going to have to rule as regent in their stead. This idea of regency was fairly common in the Middle Ages, and it would happen when a king died and his heir was too young to exercise any political authority at all, but was clearly and uncontestedly going to inherit the throne. And so you needed somebody to administer government and to hold that space until the young heir came of age. And so it's this role that we see Adelaide stepping into, basically trying to keep things running in Sicily until her son is old enough to assume rule himself. Unfortunately, Adelaide's oldest son, Simon, died at the tender age of 12. This meant that the younger brother, Roger II, is going to be in line to inherit his father's position. Now, although Roger's father, Roger I, was a Norman, and in many ways an outsider to Sicily, someone who was blonde and blue-eyed and Latin Christian and spoke Old French and came from a very different society, Roger II was a product of Sicily itself. He grew up in Palermo, this city where Greek Orthodox mosaics mixed with muezzin calls from the mosques in the afternoon, where date palms swayed, and where his tutors spoke Greek and Arabic. Young Roger himself spoke fluent Arabic, a fact which astonished his contemporaries in other parts of Europe when they encountered him many years later as a Latin Christian king of Sicily. When Roger turned 16, his mother Adelaide ended her term as regent and handed over the rule of government to her teenage son, who of course would be assisted by the many able and experienced administrators who were part of the Sicilian state. So it's at this point that Adelaide receives an intriguing offer. King Baldwin of Jerusalem proposes to marry her. So Adelaide is the widow of Roger I. She's the mother of two sons, one of whom is now dead, and the other is a 16-year-old ruler. So why would she be interested in this anyway? Well, although Roger I ruled Sicily, He was never a king. His title was Duke. So effectively, he was the governor. He controlled everything, but he wasn't a monarch officially. In all details of actual power, he was, but he didn't have the crown to go with it. So Adelaide was his wife, and she ruled in Palermo, but she wasn't a queen. King Baldwin of Jerusalem was proposing to make her one, and Jerusalem itself was a storied place then as it is now. Now, you will doubtless be wondering, why is there a King Baldwin ruling in Jerusalem? That sounds like a very non-native name, as indeed it is. Remember that the First Crusade took place between 1096 and 1099, and the outcome of this was that Christian armies took over the state of Jerusalem from Muslims. Several of these crusaders stayed in the Holy Land and carved out territory for themselves. And Baldwin is one of these foreigners who's now taken up residence and is ruling over the Crusader state of Jerusalem. But this is now 1112, 13 years after the end of that crusade, and King Baldwin has to find some way of paying the soldiers who help him maintain his control of this city. He's short of funds. And Sicily has a reputation for having become even more wealthy in the last few decades than it was before. Sicily is booming, and therefore the rulers of Sicily must be very rich. So what Baldwin is thinking is that if he proposes to Adelaide and she accepts, she's going to bring with her a very substantial dowry. A dowry being the payment that normally accompanied a woman into her new marriage. And the size of a woman's dowry, especially in upper-class families and royal families, was often the sole determinant of who she married. So make no mistake, this is not a long-distance romance. King Baldwin has his eyes on the purse strings, and he proposes to Adelaide that she come and marry him, become Queen of Jerusalem, and bring with her the sort of dowry that she should, coming from Sicily. Now, Adelaide wasn't a fool. She was a very canny negotiator. She understood what the interests were at play in this negotiation, and she had some demands of her own. She was willing to accept Baldwin's offer, but on one condition. In the event that their marriage produced no children, her existing son, Roger II, should inherit the rule of Jerusalem. Now, Adelaide at the time was 35 years old, so there was a decent chance that she could produce a child with Baldwin, but perhaps it wouldn't work. So she had her eye on the future of her son, and she wanted to make sure that he got something out of this arrangement. This seemed like a fair gamble for both sides, and Baldwin accepted her terms. There was just one little problem. Baldwin was already married. Now, his wife apparently had caused all kinds of scandal. They had separated. She hadn't lived with the king for quite some time, but he hadn't gone through the formal process of annulling or divorcing her. So technically speaking, he was still married, even though he was living like a single man. Now, Baldwin was evidently willing to ignore this technicality, and it seems that Adelaide's advisors did the same. And so she came from Sicily with a very large entourage, with an enormous profusion of gifts. Her arrival in Jerusalem has been described by some as like the landing of Cleopatra. So opulent, lavish. Adelaide made good on her end of the deal. And the two were married, and very quickly the dowry that she had brought was spent, solving Baldwin's financial problems. Unfortunately, the marriage had all too short a lease. Only 5 years later, in 1117, Baldwin fell gravely ill, and no child had been produced in his marriage with Adelaide. So as Baldwin is lying ill in bed, a group of powerful men from Jerusalem gather, and they are very concerned. They're very concerned that because no child has been produced as a result of the marriage with Adelaide, that now Jerusalem is going to be handed over to the rule of some unknown foreigner from Sicily. And so they prevail on the patriarch of Jerusalem, the highest-ranking churchman in the city, to have a little talk with their king. And the patriarch sits down next to Baldwin and suddenly remembers something that he had apparently forgotten for the last 5 years, which was that the king was actually still married to his first wife. And now he'd married a second one. And so he was guilty of the sin of bigamy, and this was very serious. Now, we don't know exactly what the patriarch said, but his intercession with the king was evidently very effective because Baldwin was pressured or persuaded to put Adelaide away, meaning to send her home, to dismiss her, to say, whoops, I guess I married you illegally and I guess we can't be married anymore. I guess you better go back home to your family in Sicily. You can't stay here anymore. That dowry you brought with you, yeah, sorry, it's all been spent. So, it's been nice knowing you. This dismissal of Adelaide after 5 years of marriage was obviously deeply humiliating. It was a grave insult to her and to her family. It was a shameful exit from Jerusalem back to Sicily. When Adelaide returned to Sicily, she found a very different son from the one she'd left behind. Roger was no longer a teenager. He was now 21 years old, a tall, dark, sturdy young man, very much in command of the capital. Now, Adelaide was only 40 the year that she returned, but within a year of her arrival in Sicily, she was dead. Roger would never forget the humiliation of his mother, from which she had never recovered. A humiliation inflicted at the hands of the Crusaders and specifically the King of Jerusalem. Many years later, as a far more powerful, older king, Roger would turn down appeals for help from the Crusaders in Jerusalem precisely because he remembered exactly what they had done to his mother. Now, the same year that Adelaide returns to Sicily at the end of her second marriage, it's going to be the year that her son Roger II begins his first marriage. At the age of 21, he marries a young woman named Elvira of Castile. She's the daughter of King Alfonso VI, the King of Castile and Leon in modern Spain. Her mother was a Muslim woman named Zaida, who adopted the Christian name Isabella when she married King Alfonso. So Elvira, this Spanish princess who becomes the bride of Roger II, is actually half Arab and comes from Spain, which at the time was another extremely mixed society, a place where Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived in the same areas as neighbors. And one wonders what perspective Elvira brought with her to Sicily, which would be her new home. We know that Roger II fell very much in love with his wife, and that theirs was a long and happy marriage. So it seems impossible that her perspectives didn't have some influence on his, and that she didn't have a hand in shaping the type of kingdom that Sicily was going to become under Roger II's reign. While royal marriages were almost always made for dynastic considerations, we have concrete proof that Roger II fell very much in love with his wife. So much so that when she died many years later, he grieved her so intensely that he isolated himself in his private rooms, seeing almost nobody, until rumors spread that he himself had died. So while the choice of Elvira as a partner certainly had to be informed by political considerations, we have every assurance that it became a marriage in every real sense of the word. Now, having made a good marriage himself, Roger looked to build alliances and to consolidate his power outside of Sicily. And one of the moves that he made here was to marry his sister Matilda to a man called Rainulf of Alife. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing Alife correctly. It is an Italian name. But Rainulf was a southern Italian baron, so he was on the mainland. Rainulf lived in Apulia, a region of southern Italy that the Normans had for many decades been attempting to dominate, and Apulia, like Calabria, was the territory that Robert Guiscard, Roger II's uncle, had claimed as his own. So effectively, Rainulf of Alife would have been one of Robert Guiscard's vassals, if Robert Guiscard was still alive. But he wasn't. And who had inherited the control of his domains? Well, his son. Now, if you watched the last episode, you'll know that Robert Guiscard had a number of sons, and his oldest, Bohemond, with his first wife, was effectively delegitimized and declared a bastard when Robert divorced his mom and married another woman. But Bohemond had inherited his father's physical and mental characteristics, so he was extremely effective and ambitious militarily like his father, but because he was disinherited, he left southern Italy and went off with other crusaders and founded one of those crusader states I was talking about in Antioch. That was Robert Guiscard's firstborn son. So he doesn't get southern Italy, his dad's territory. The person who gets that is Robert Guiscard's second son, confusingly also named Roger, but we're not going to talk about that. Robert Guiscard's second son, he has with his second wife, Sicilgata, that Lombard princess in the habit of wearing full body armor and accompanying her warlike husband on every military campaign. So you would think that Robert Guiscard, a lifelong warlord, and Sicilgata, this Germanic war goddess, would produce between them some sort of wunderkind. But no, that's not what happened. Their son was not at all like his parents, not physically and not mentally. He was a quiet, bookish sort, very scholarly. He enjoyed conversations with monks and bishops. He was a great patron of the church and the arts, but he wasn't really good at terrifying aggressive vassals who might decide to not pay their dues or to take property that wasn't theirs. And as a result, the territory that Robert Guiscard, the father, had established in southern Italy was continuously threatened by rebellious vassals like Rainulf of Alife, who we'll hear about more. And therefore, Robert Guiscard's son constantly had to ask for help from who? His cousin in Sicily, Roger II. And so we see this process beginning where Roger II, just like his father Roger I before him, begin to help out in southern Italy their relatives. And as a cost for this assistance, they get to take back control of the rents in Sicily that used to belong to Robert Guiscard, and gradually to acquire some of the southern Italian dominions for themselves. So now we enter this period where we see Roger II, who's the ruler of Sicily, begin to try and gradually take over the territories that his uncle, Robert Guiscard, had established in southern Italy. And it's a very convoluted chapter, so I'm going to try and carve a clear line through it for you. But essentially, there are a number of descendants of Robert Guiscard. One of them, the Duke of Apulia, dies without an heir. And Roger II, who's directly related to him, says that this duke promised that because he had no children, that he would recognize Roger II as his heir to inherit Apulia. The problem was that apparently this Duke of Apulia had had financial problems and had made similar promises to a number of people. So when he dies, Roger II confidently rides into Apulia, expecting to stake his claim and take this territory for himself, only to realize that it's a hotly contested claim and it's not going to be a straightforward process at all. Now remember, the Pope had initially granted the Normans legitimacy to rule parts of southern Italy and Sicily. And the Pope is really unhappy about seeing someone as increasingly powerful and wealthy as Roger II take over Apulia, which is right on the border with the Papal States. And so this Pope, who is now Honorius II, demands that Roger abandon this claim because, at least on paper, the Pope is sort of the feudal overlord of that whole area. And so he's granted the Normans rights to rule parts of it technically under his authority. And so he's pulling rank on Roger II and saying, Not so fast. I don't want you taking Apulia. I'm not giving permission for this. So this is in 1127. Roger's response is to marshal an army and return the fighting season of the very next year in 1128. Roger's army arrives and faces off against an army that's been marshaled by the Pope. And so once again, we have this scene where a Norman army is going to fight an army led by the Pope over land. The Norman army is stronger, and so Pope Honorius is forced to concede and basically say, okay, right, never mind what I said before. I guess you can have Apulia. So he doesn't just look the other way. The Pope actually invests Roger with the title of Duke of Apulia. So it's now legitimate, it's above board. Roger II has gotten the title the same way his uncle Robert Guiscard had. In exactly the same way, actually, because as you may recall, Robert Guiscard got his southern Italian territory by leading an army to face an army led by the Pope. That was the Battle of Civitate, which we covered in our last episode. So let's pause for a moment and consider this peculiar image of the Normans, who are Latin Christians, once again fighting against an army led by the Pope, who is the head of the Latin Christian Church. What's going on here? So this is kind of a bizarre image for us to imagine. I mean, no one can picture the Pope today donning armor or military fatigues and driving off to lead an army on a campaign in the field. But that is exactly what we see going on, not once, but repeatedly in this chapter of Italian history. And so it's very strange for us if we view this through a religious lens. What are the Normans, Latin Christians, doing fighting an army led by the Latin Christian Pope? Why? But I'm going to suggest to you that the religious lens is the wrong lens to look at this with. Because religion is by far not the only thing and not even the most important thing about explaining these events. Yes, the Pope was a religious leader, but he was also a feudal lord, someone who owned actual physical territory in southern Italy and collected rents from there. And so he has a double role. Yes, he has a religious function, he has a religious title, but that's not the role that he's exercising when he rolls into southern Italy at the head of an army. Here, he's a feudal lord defending his territory against a potentially threatening new neighbor. So he has another set of interests that are also at play, and the Normans recognize that. They don't see their religion as compromised by a fight over territory with another landowner in the area. So it's important for us to realize that the Normans saw this double role, even if you and I have forgotten about it. To complicate matters further, the Pope has another function that's in between the strictly religious and the strictly uh, territorial, and that is he has this ability to confer political titles. And most famously, the popes have, at this point for generations, conferred the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which was something that they initially conferred upon Frankish kings and continue to do so. And so we see this long-standing alliance between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, otherwise known as the King of the Franks. And every time there's a new Frankish king, he has to come down and have this imperial title conferred on him by the Pope. And in exchange, there are military obligations that the Franks have. So when the Pope calls and says, I need help, very frequently the Frankish armies, the Holy Roman Emperor's armies, will march down. So the Pope has the ability to confer that title, but as we've seen, he's also conferred other titles on Normans in the past, the right to rule certain parts of Italy. And how the Pope has the authority to do this is an interesting question that we don't have time to delve deeply into here, but for the purposes of our story, just know that he does this. And so he has strictly religious interests, he's got his own feudal landlord interests, and he also has this intermediary role where he can legitimize political titles for ambitious military leaders. And that's also something that Roger II has an interest in here. So when he manages to get the Pope, Honorius II, to admit defeat, he's able to extract the Pope conferring the legitimacy of this title, Duke of Apulia, onto Roger II. So he's just expanded his territory. He's not just the ruler of Sicily now, he now has official title and territorial holdings in mainland southern Italy as well. So he's beginning to acquire and absorb the other Norman territories that his uncle, Robert Guiscard, had initially acquired. So at the end of the year 1128, Roger II is crowned Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily by Pope Honorius II. He's only 32 years old and already one of the most powerful princes in Western Europe. He only needs a crown. He's not officially a king. And it's going to be another pope who will be his route to getting that crown. So it was only 2 years later, early in the year 1130, that Pope Honorius II, after a period of illness, died. At this point, there was something of a scandal. So the normal procedure when a pope dies is that the College of Cardinals in Rome gather together and they confer and they elect from amongst their own number, from amongst the ranks of cardinals, who will be the next pope. Now, this is always a very political procedure, and different cardinal candidates are backed by different factions. And this is inevitably intertwined with Italian politics and very wealthy and powerful Italian aristocratic families. So always at this point, there are rival candidates. There's money being passed around to help persuade people to vote for one candidate or another. This is all usual. What was unusual is that there were two highly developed and powerful factions in Rome at the time, led by competing Italian families. And before the Pope was even quite dead, one of these factions started to maneuver to try and get an edge on the upcoming papal election. And as a result, on February 15th in the year 1130, by the end of the day, there was one dead pope and two new ones. That's right. The different factions had both elected their own candidate, and so there were now two rival popes who were both laying claim to the crown of St. Peter and the leadership of the Western Christian Church. They were known as Innocent II and Anacletus. Now, Anacletus had much more support within Rome itself, and as a result, he was quickly able to take possession of St. Peter's and have his coronation there, while Innocent had to have his papal coronation at another church in the city, a slightly less glorious one. And very quickly, because support for Anacletus was so strong in Rome, the rival candidate, Innocent, was forced to leave. So he left Rome, he left Italy, and begins to campaign for himself and the legitimacy of his holding the papal crown in parts of Europe. As a result of this, what seemed like a triumph for Anacletus in Rome very quickly slipped away because the rival pope, Innocent, was able to successfully acquire the support of major monastic orders across Europe, in France, major figures in the church like Bernard of Clairvaux, and even the Holy Roman Emperor, whose vote had many times in the past been the deciding factor in beginning and ending the careers of popes. If you want to know more about that, you should listen to our series on the Great Schism, because this goes back quite a ways. So we have these two rival popes, Anacletus, who's preferred in Rome and most of Italy, and Innocent II, who very quickly acquires much more support everywhere else. Once the Holy Roman Emperor had weighed in on the side of Innocent II, Pope Anacletus realized that he was in a precarious position, and he desperately needed a strong military ally. And who better to turn to than Roger II, the increasingly powerful Duke of Sicily, Apulia, and Calabria, who only 2 years before had led an army so strong that it had defeated the army of the previous pope. So Anacletus sends messengers to Roger of Sicily, and he appeals to him for help. Roger II was sympathetic to the messages from Anacletus, and shrewd enough to realize that the Pope desperately needed his support, which he was happy to provide, in exchange for just one little thing: a crown. So the deal that was made was that Roger II promised to support the Pope, to endorse his legitimacy, including by force of arms. But in exchange, the Pope would need to crown him king of all his existing domains: Sicily, Apulia, and Calabria. And so it was on Christmas Day in 1130 that a splendid coronation was held in Palermo. Roger II became king of a group of territories that had not yet been united under one ruler. He wasn't just king of Sicily, but also of Apulia and Calabria, a territory that now encompassed an island and parts of the mainland. Here he had succeeded where both his father and uncle had not, but his success was directly a product of their lifelong endeavors. Roger II had united all their territories under one rule and was now, as king, a peer of any other monarch in Europe. He'd come a very long way for the son of a Norman brigand. The coronation was lavish. Roger was willing to spend like a king to celebrate the fact that he now officially was one. But taking sides in a period of papal schism is always a risky business. Roger's crown had been bestowed upon him by Anacletus, who was recognized as pope in Rome and large parts of Italy, but not for very long anywhere else in Western Europe. And so, by backing Anacletus, Roger had made a decision that had won him a crown, but would also have a price tag attached to that. But that is a story for another episode. I hope you've enjoyed this chapter of the Normans in Sicily. It's episode 2 in a series, and the story isn't over. So if you've enjoyed it, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And please also consider joining us on Patreon if you're interested in the live question and answer sessions that always come out after the release of each new episode, as well as bonus content and messages and chat that's available to supporters there. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.